It's like panic stations. That's what it feels like from the US administration. And let's do anything we can to reassure people. This is a real severe energy shock, and it's going to be felt globally.
I think this goes into next month. I think that Donald Trump cannot be seen to have concluded this war while Iran is setting the pace of events in Hormuz, and that will drag him into a bigger campaign, possibly one even involving ground forces.
We have crossed the Rubicon. There is going to be a long-term impact, even if the war itself ends tomorrow.
Welcome to this latest edition of the Forecast, yet again from me in Jerusalem. And again, it's been a very busy day. The Saudi foreign minister has just said in the last few minutes that Saudi Arabia reserves the right to retaliate to Iran if attacks on its oil and gas facilities continue. There's a general sense in the last 24 hours that this war, which has become an economic war on so many levels, has escalated quite dramatically. Well, to talk about this escalation, the economic impact, but also the military options, I'm joined now by Shashank Joshi, he's the defense editor of The Economist, and Helia Ebrahimi, our very own economics editor in London. Welcome to you both. Let me start with you, Helia. I mean, the markets they're not quite panicking today. I thought they might be panicking a bit more, but the numbers are looking pretty dreadful as a result of what's happened in the last 24 hours.
I think you have seen a considerable step up actually in markets. You know, you're talking about gas prices in Europe that have gone up, over 30%. Oil has gone up, but also UK borrowing. You've got the Bank of England now saying that this is a shock and that inflation is going to be impossible to hide from. So you've got some real nerves and anxieties in the system coming on the back of the news we've just heard with the Qataris saying that actually the damage to their gas site is going to take capacity for 3 to 5 years. That is a really big step change in demand.
That's extraordinary, because this was the biggest gas facility in the world, wasn't it?
1,800 trillion, cubic feet of gas under there, part owned by Qatar, part owned by Iran. Both sides have been attacked now in the last 24 hours and really sending, energy experts into a frenzy about what does this mean for long-term supply, because closing the Strait of Hormuz had kind of been the nightmare scenario for any economist on what would happen, would there be an oil shock, and relatively the market has been quite sanguine about it on this kind of forever optimism that the strait would open and everything would resume. And what we've seen happen today is confirmation that there is going to be a long-term impact, even if the war itself ends tomorrow.
I noticed, Helia, that in Vietnam, the authorities have been telling people to take the stairs and to work from home. And the same thing's happened in a number of Asian countries where they rely very heavily on gas from places like Qatar, where they haven't been getting oil or gas through the Straits of Hormuz for weeks now.
You're absolutely right. Asia is the primary recipient of Qatari gas. Qatari gas, it supplies 20% of the world's entire gas needs, and most of it goes to Asia. And so when you're talking about supply, disappearing, you have to talk about demand on the other side also coming down. And so you're hearing about, are there discussions about controls? Are there discussions about export controls and usage controls? And the coming days will really define whether those become serious policy levers.
Shashank, I mean, it's a truism to say that wars never quite work out when they collide with reality, to what the generals and the leaders designed for that particular conflict. But in this case, you kind of ask yourself, whoops, that's interesting. So just to let you know, we've just had another alarm. And so we'll see how this develops, because sometimes they go away and we can stay and carry on, and sometimes they don't, in which case we have to take this conversation elsewhere or resume. So I'm going to ask you a question, and we'll take the view after that. What are the military options here to defeat, to win this economic war, both in the Straits and when it comes to battles between Iran and the Israelis and the Americans, and possibly even the Gulf states over their facilities?
Well, Matt, there's two ways to look at this. One of them is deterrence, which says to Iran, if you hit our gas fields, I hit you back. And that's what we saw from Donald Trump, saying that if Iran continues, he would be willing to destroy the entire South Pars gas field, which, of course, is shared with Qatar. That may not be entirely credible, given that Iran can then in turn cause even more damage on top of the already catastrophic damage we've just heard described. But that's a sort of tit for tat, I hit you back if you hit me approach. The other approach is more to do with getting oil and gas and commodities out of the Persian Gulf beyond the Strait of Hormuz. Some of that we know is already moving. Iran is allowing some traffic through, but it's also preventing other tankers from getting through on pain of being attacked. The focus of that has been on mines, but the real threat has probably come from drones, as well as other missiles and what we call fast attack craft. The military option to deal with that is really complicated because it means you not only have to take out all the possible ways Iran could lay mines, and we have recently seen America bombing mine laying craft as well as other ships and boats, because you can lay these things from fishing vessels, but you also have to strike missile launchers and drone launchers, which are much harder to spot. They can be the back of a truck inland. And of course, as you know, some of these drones, particularly the Shahed type drones, can be launched from more than 1,000 kilometers inland. And so it's not enough just to have your drones surveilling that little strip of a couple of kilometers into the Iranian coast all along the Strait of Hormuz, although that's pretty hard in itself because a lot of this is mountainous, complex terrain. You are also surveilling and then potentially having to strike really hundreds of thousands of square kilometers into Iran, or at least thousands of square kilometers, I should say, into Iran, which would tax even America, the most powerful armed forces in the world.
And Shashank, do you think that the American planners of this war, and I'm assuming that there were planners involved at some stage, just didn't take this into account, or took it into account but the president wasn't interested? Or did they just think that the regime would collapse after a few days? What was going on in their minds?
I think somewhere along the way, planners at America's Central Command, CENTCOM, in Florida, would have certainly thought about these scenarios. It's implausible that they didn't, because we've been discussing the closure of the Strait of Hormuz for years, going back more than 20 years, and it was indeed a scenario America faced in terms of escorting shipping.
No one thought it was actually going to materialize, Shashank, did they? I mean, that's the false kind of confidence that they've had.
Correct. No one thought it would materialize because no one thought Iran would be put in so desperate a situation where it would be a viable approach. But of course, if you kill Ayatollah Khamenei on day one and then say you wish to topple the regime, then it's an entirely realistic planning assumption. And I think that the political leadership thought Iran would be hit so badly, it would effectively be left reeling, and the rump regime would do a deal with America, just like the Venezuelan government did. And it is that plan that I think has fallen apart when it made contact with reality.
The Pars gas field for Iran, which was attacked by Israelis, is incredibly important for the Iranian regime and for the country. It fuels, 70-something% of their whole energy demands. I mean, 2 million cars, homes, heating, industrial power. So the risk of allowing, the Americans or the Israelis to damage that could be really, really critical for the Iranian regime if internally, domestically, people lose power. A country that is already pushed to the limits in terms of their economic experience and are very frustrated with the government could be tipped into, revolution if you suddenly have these huge blackouts.
It's interesting. I spoke to the Israeli president, Itzhak Herzog, just a couple of hours ago near Tel Aviv, on the site of some missile fragments that had fallen yesterday onto an Arab-Israeli village. And he basically, I asked him about this. I said, did the Israelis get permission from the Americans to bomb the South Pars oil gas field? And he said that, that's beyond my pay grade, more or less. I'm not involved in operational stuff. But clearly, he looked a little bit embarrassed, I have to say. And you kind of wonder, what goes through the minds of both the Israelis and the Americans to so clearly escalate the war, the economic war, by hitting that oil field, that gas field, which of course is also owned by Qatar, supposedly one of America's best friends.
Well, I think part of it is that the Israeli government, much more clearly so than the United States, is attempting to topple the regime. I think Donald Trump is not so sure whether he really wishes to do that. He still wants to deter the regime. I think he still harbors hope of drawing an end to this without a full-scale toppling of the regime. But Israel, in terms of killing Ali Larijani, in terms of threatening to kill Mojtaba Khamenei, in terms of attacks on besieged paramilitary checkpoints, everything we see suggests they are trying to undercut the regime and create the conditions for regime change.
Right. Helia, I mean, just to be really clear about the economic consequences here, blocking the Straits of Hormuz, which is what Iran has effectively done in the almost 3 weeks since the war began, is really serious. And we've seen the trickle of containers going through now and tankers compared to what it was before. We've seen the effect on oil and gas prices, on fertilizer, et cetera, et cetera. But attacking the oil installations, the gas installations of these states, all the way from Saudi Arabia, to Bahrain, Kuwait, Abu Dhabi. I mean, that's different level, isn't it?
I mean, we have crossed the Rubicon, Matt. And you were talking yesterday about the list that the Iranians produced after Pars was attacked, saying these are the targets we're now going to look at, and they've gone after them. I think you've got to really, you heard today, not just from the Bank of England here in the UK, but from Christine Lagarde in Europe, talking about this is a real severe energy shock. And it's going to be felt globally. You were talking about the kind of the impact when it comes to oil, but of course, it's not just oil and gas. It feeds through not just into transportation, but into foods, into semiconductors, to all parts of our economy. So the ramifications of creating this step change, everyone is talking about this is now no longer about, are we going to get, let me put it like this, Matt. At the beginning of this conflict, people were saying, well, listen, don't worry, because we've got a glut of oil supply. And actually, Europe has got a lot of gas as well. And the winter is, finishing and we're into the summer months. So actually, we're going to be relatively insulated. I think what we're talking about now is that production has been damaged so that the long-term escalation of this, the long-term impact is going to be felt on the global economy for a while to come.
By the way, we can hear some rumbling in the distance. I think that's thunder. It's certainly on the forecast. And if it's something else, I'm sure that the alarm would go off again. There's always a second alarm from the city of Jerusalem, which is much louder. And that's when and from the hotel, by the way, that's when we scuttle into the corridor to continue the conversation behind some very, very thick walls. Shashank, what would it take, do you think, for the Saudis and others to come good on their very veiled threats that they might get militarily involved in this war?
Well, of course, as you know, Matt, there have been some suggestions they have covertly retaliated already. I've heard that from some Israeli sources. Now, of course, they fervently deny that. As you might expect they would. But I think given the escalation we have seen, particularly against upstream oil infrastructure in the last few days, I think we're getting quite close to the point where they could decide one of two things. Firstly, participation in a US-led military effort to escort ships through Hormuz, although we are still some way away from that, given you would have to degrade the missile and drone threat, and I think that takes at least another week or so. The other, more expansive option would be that the Gulf states could directly participate in retaliating in strikes on Iranian oil infrastructure. They have the weapons to do it. They have things like the Storm Shadow missiles that Ukraine has been firing against Russia that can go a very long distance. But I think it would be a huge call for them to make. But if these energy attacks continue, and if there continues to be that sense this war has escalated to the lifeline of the Gulf states, and particularly if Iran begins touching desalination facilities, which, as you know, the Gulf states depend on for survival, I think at that stage there is a pretty good likelihood that even these very cautious countries are dragged into this campaign.
But Matt, foreign policy is being turned on its head in some places here, because you've also got today Scott Bessent. Today he's been talking about the fact that the US is going to look at taking sanctions off Iranian oil. In the midst of this conflict, suggesting that the US would take sanctions off Iranian oil. I mean, it is completely extraordinary.
Which I think tells you how rattled they are, how concerned and sensitive they are to the energy impact, despite what JD Vance said today, which is, don't worry, the consolation is our allies are much more affected. And if you're Iran listening to that, what lesson do you take? I think the lesson you take is, this is very painful for us, but we can outlast the Americans. And I think that's what a lot of hardliners will be saying, including Saeed Jalili, who is reportedly the man who's going to succeed Ali Larijani.
Okay, so that's the siren. What we're going to do, because I know you're all very busy, we're going to take this all inside. And by the way, rather good timing, because the heavens are about to open as well in more senses than one. So we're going to take this stuff inside. We're going to carry on the conversation either in the bunker of the hotel or in the corridor, which is almost like a bunker because there's some very thick walls.
But Shashank, when I went to see the insurers about this idea of ferrying ships,
Yes.
they said to me, it's a flip of a coin whether you think if the US is ferrying, if the US Navy is ferrying the ship, whether it's an improvement in the risk outcome, or actually because the US is a combatant, it takes the risk up. So from there, this is what they were saying in Lloyd's. It will insure you, but it might not improve what we price it at.
It's a really good point, and I think you've got to look at the Iran-Iraq tanker war here, and how the risk was never brought completely down. And I think we've just got to learn the idea of reopening the strait is a misnomer here. I think it's never going to be binary. But it's open again. It's going to be just a what can you do to increase volumes getting through? That's really what it will boil down to. But have you seen the Iranians now talking about charging a fee?
Oh yeah, I saw that in Parliament.
They feel emboldened, don't they? And so they should. It's rational from their perspective to try and take advantage.
It's to your point, isn't it, that you were saying they don't need to outfire, or be able to win this war. They just need to outlast the Americans, and that is critical here, because the pain tolerance, going back to what Scott Bessent was saying, are they really going to not, take sanctions off US oil? Or do they just look at crude and think, ooh, today is a good day to try and say anything, because they're talking about releasing more oil in strategic reserves as well. It's like panic stations. That's what it feels like from the US administration. And let's do anything we can to reassure people. Matt, how are you doing? You look safe.
I look safe and a little bit yellow. I think that's something. So anyway, thanks guys for continuing the conversation. Let's just quickly talk about Russia. Helia, first to you and then to Shashank. For Russia, economically, this is a massive win. I wonder whether it's a win militarily as well, because of course, all those drones that might have been going to Russia from Iran are now being used by the Iranians themselves. First to you, Helia, on Russia.
From a financial perspective, Russia is the clear winner from this conflict. You've got a situation where not only is their primary asset going up in value, but the US has already taken sanctions off and given a waiver to the Russians to sell their oil, sell it to India, but also to sell it. And it's very difficult when you talk to traders and oil analysts. They say it's very unlikely that those sanctions return. So Russia is a massive beneficiary when you have oil go from $60 to $120. They're a big winner.
What about militarily, Shashank?
Well, I agree with all of that. And militarily, the only thing to add, of course, is that this war is, as you know, putting immense pressure on availability of stockpiles of air defense interceptors, including those for Patriot systems that are also used by Ukraine. And that was already a problem prior to this conflict. For example, Germany was trying to buy stocks of American PAC-3 interceptor missiles to then give to Ukraine under something called the Pearl scheme, P-U-R-L. And America was saying, we're not sure about this. I think we need these ourselves. We now have a situation where we've had unprecedented consumption of these things. Volodymyr Zelensky says more used up in the first few days in the Gulf of advanced PAC-3 interceptors, the PAC-3 MSE, than his country has used in 3 or 4 years of war. And so it will become ever harder for Ukraine to get these. And in my assessment, given how limited annual production is, the effect of that will be felt for years to come, as Taiwan, Ukraine, Europeans all scramble for the same fairly limited production capacity of these essential munitions.
I mean, the thing that's really fascinated me, Shashank, is that the Americans and the Israelis together have these, precision munitions, these very smart bombs. You can argue about the smartness of the political considerations behind what they're doing, but they've got these very smart weapons that are able to take out people in their bedrooms. They kill the Ayatollah on day one of the conflict, etc., etc. And they've done 15 or 16,000 sorties already, which is an extraordinary number. And yet the Iranians are still able to disrupt the economies of the Gulf states, to upend, the energy market and all the rest of it. So the question, Shashank, is, how are they still able to do this? And are they planning it carefully so that they're doing something every day, but they're keeping a lot, for, even the rainiest day of rainy days?
I think there is some evidence they have been husbanding their resources. I think a large part of the reason their missile launches are down dramatically from the first 3 days is that their launchers are being hunted. There's no doubt about it. But I think they are also holding back some stockpiles. And what's really interesting, Matt, is despite that pressure you describe, which is an intense campaign of thousands of sorties a day, you are still seeing the rate of Iranian drone and missile launches basically go up in the past week. And I think that's very impressive. And I think the answer to that is very simple. Iran is a big, big country, and hunting for missile launchers, let alone drone launchers, is an incredibly difficult task. If you superimpose Iran on the map of the continental United States, you will see how huge it is. And if the Houthis, a rebel group in Yemen, were able to continue firing at ships in the Red Sea last year, despite an American bombing campaign, then we shouldn't be surprised that Iran, a large country with a massive stockpile of missiles and a very determined leadership, has been able to keep up sporadic missile fire for 10 days.
Okay, so final and brief question to both of you. First, you, Shashank, given what you've just described, what is your hunch about how long this will continue and how might it end? Would it be military exhaustion or some kind of political deal?
I think this goes into next month. I think that Donald Trump cannot be seen to have left the war or concluded this war while Iran is setting the pace of events in Hormuz. And that will drag him into a bigger campaign, possibly one even involving ground forces to do something like seize Harg Island at the northern side of the Persian Gulf, something to attack or seize Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium. And that will be something that can only be measured in weeks, not days. So I do not see an end to this until April. And I think it still ends with the Iranian regime greatly weakened, but still in power in Tehran.
Helia, what does this mean for the ordinary consumer? And what are the political repercussions of that likely to be?
Look, we went from a position today where the Bank of England was going to cut interest rates. That was the expectation, not just that would help consumers, but government in charge were quite keen that they do that, so that you could have this 2-month landing strip going towards the May elections that would bring some ease to consumers, that would make things a bit easier. Interest rates were going to go down, inflation was going to go down. Well, hang about. That is now completely off the table. The Bank of England are talking about an energy shock now, and inflation actually, almost certainly going up. And traders are betting, I think in the market today, it's almost a 50% chance that interest rates not only don't get cut, but they get hiked 3 times this year. So that is a very different outlook for the UK consumers. And this is, the Chancellor was saying at the beginning of the week, oh my God, we've got this in hand because the UK is in a much stronger position today than we were before the Ukraine crisis. But, we were looking at all the fuel poverty figures, and it's hard to see how that's possible because actually fuel poverty has gone up. There are many more people in the UK who are unable to pay their energy bills today, and the amount that's owed to energy companies is much higher, sometimes double, sometimes triple what it was in 2022. So the position of UK consumers is much, much harder today.
Shashank Joshi, a defense editor at The Economist, Helia Ebrahimi, economics editor of Channel 4 News. Thank you so much to both of you. I'm sure we'll be back here again soon. Hope you enjoy the podcast.